egy pár mondatot mondok magyarul, és utána fogok beszélni angolul. Egy sztorit szeretnék mesélni. Volt egy nagyon híres zsidó lap, zsidó újság itt Magyarországon, az Egyenlőség. Ezt lehet, hogy ismerik az Egyenlőség című lapot. Az utolsó szerkesztője volt a Szabolcsi Lajos, akinek az apukája, Szabolcsi Miksa, volt az alapítója. És a Szabolcsi Lajos azt írta az emlékiratában, hogy az apukája azt akarta hinni, hogy kazár származású zsidó lenne. Ő tudta, hogy valószínűleg magyarországi vagy galíciai zsidó, de azt akarta hinni, hogy kazár származású magyar zsidó volt. És a mai előadás arról van szó, de az kicsit a galiciai, a magyar zsidóság galiciai eredetéről, de főleg a kazár mitusról. És most egy kicsit fogok beszélni a kazárokról. És nem vagyok biztos benne, hogy mindenki tudja, hogy kik voltak a kazárok. The Kazars, as we say in English, it's important to know who the Kazars were before we talk about this fantasy of Szabolcsi Miksa or Szabolcsi Lajos. The Kazars were a Turkic tribe that lived between the 7th century and the 11th century in eastern Crimea, and in the North Caucasus. It was a state that was between the Byzantine Empire, an empire between the Byzantine Empire and the Umayyad Empire of the Muslims. And we don't know much about the Kazars. Most of the literature that we read on the Kazars says they probably lived then. Their empire probably was this big. And for our purposes, the literature also says they probably converted to Judaism. Okay, so the Kazars, who were a fairly big empire, according to some legends and some historical sources, at some point in the 8th and 9th centuries, converted to Judaism. We don't know if the entire tribe converted to Judaism. We don't know if only the leaders, or the rulers, or the ruling class converted to Judaism. But what we know is that there were tales that were told, and we have contemporary eyewitness reports of Khazars practicing Judaism in the Khazar Empire. Okay, so one thing that's important for our story here, and for Szabolcsi Miksa, is that there is this legend, which is probably rooted in some fact, that the Khazars converted to Judaism at some point in the 8th and 9th centuries. The other thing that's important for us to know is that Khazaria, or the Khazar Empire, was right next to the area where the Magyarok, where the Hungarian tribes originally came from, at least according to the Hungarian legends. So we know, or think more or less, that the Jewish Khazars and the original Hungarian tribes were neighbors. And of course, this is significant because from there, the Magyars migrated westward. What we know about the conversion of the Khazars, I could give you a whole talk on what we know about them, but the short version of the conversion story is that they had Christians on one side, Byzantium, they had Muslims on the other side, the Umayyad Empire, and they didn't want to choose a religion that would force them to take sides. So they chose Judaism because Judaism was a a neutral religion. They didn't have to side with the Muslims, they didn't have to side with the Christians, they could side with this powerless Jewish community. There's a lot of legends on this. The most famous one has come down to us through Judah Levi, a 12th century Spanish rabbi. And also there is an alleged correspondence between Hasdai ibn Shaprut. He was a 10th century Spanish Jew who allegedly corresponded with King Joseph, the king of the Khazars. Again, all these sources, we don't know if they're actually true, but they may be forgeries, but this is what we know about the conversion. We also know that this conversion served as the basis for a number of theories about the origins of Ashkenazic Jewry. Some of you may be familiar with Arthur Koestler, Tizenharmedik Törzs, the 13th tribe, in which he claims that all of Ashkenazic Jewry was descended from Khazars who converted to Judaism. And for Arthur Koestler, this was a way of saying, we Ashkenazic Jews have nothing to do with those Sephardic Jews. We Ashkenazic Jews actually have nothing to do with Palestine or the land of Israel. We are indigenous, autochthonous, local people here in Eastern Europe. Okay, and Arthur Koestler, who was a Zionist in his youth, also used this basically to attack Zionism. How can we Ashkenazic Jews return to Palestine if we were never there in the first place? But Arthur Koestler, who wrote this in the 1970s, got this idea from other scholars, and I won't go over all of the scholars, but one of them was an important French historian and thinker named Ernst Renan. And in the Hungarian sources, he's always referred to as Renan Ernő. And he was the first one to propose this theory that Ashkenazic Jewry is descended not from Semites, but from Khazars who converted to Judaism. Okay. And conveniently, for Hungarian Jewish historians, they could make a similar claim about Hungarian Jews. And the first one to make this claim was Kon Sámuel. Kon Sámuel, who was the rabbi at Dohány utcai synagoga. Like most rabbis, he was a főrabbi. I haven't encountered a Hungarian rabbi yet who is not a főrabbi. Okay. So he published, he was not only a rabbi but also a very important historian who published in 1884 a zsidók története Magyarországon. This is a 2-volume book. And of course he goes back to Pannonia, goes back to the ancient Jewish settlements in Hungary, but he also devotes an entire thick chapter to the Khazar origins of Hungarian Jewry. And what he claims in this book is that the Jewish Khazars, which he refers to as zsidó kazárok, and sometimes as Mózes hitű kazárok, that they joined together with the conquering tribes in the 9th century. And over here we can see where the kazárok lived. Over here we can see Levédia and Etelköz, which everybody knows, all you good Hungarians. And the Khazars allegedly joined the Hungarian tribes for the honfoglaló. They're not referred to as Khazars in the literature. They're usually referred to as kárpátok, probably a term most of you are familiar with. So the kárpátok, in some of the literature, are actually Khazars who rebelled against the Khazar leaders. And you'll see that this is going to be important in a few minutes. But what's important for Kon Sámuel is that there were Khazars who may have converted to Judaism, who joined together with the Hungarian tribes in conquering Hungary in 896. And he looks at the proximity of the kazárok to etelköz and levédia for part of his proof. Again, we don't know whether any of these kabars were in fact Jews, but it did not prevent Kon Sámuel from declaring in his book in 1884 that there were zsidók amongst the conquering tribes. Okay, and he based his claim on these documents that I referred to by Ibn Shaprut, which have a correspondence between the king of Khazaria, Joseph, and this Spanish Jew, Ibn Shaprut. And in this correspondence, Hungary is mentioned once. It's referred to as Hungarin in this Hebrew correspondence. So he presents this evidence in his book, and then he makes a remarkable claim. And I'm going to ask you to read this claim. For those of you that can see the screen, this is taken from his book, and I'm going to ask
szövegnek. Kon Sámuel, a zsidók története Magyarországon. Ha a honfoglalástól egész idáig, azaz Magyarország történelmének első 2 századában a zsidóknak megadjuk mindazt, amit a későbbi törvények 1092 óta tőlük elvettek, vagy legalább számukra megnehezítettek, akkor egy 200-as korszakban a zsidók tényleg jogaikra és társadalmi állásukra nézve teljes magyarok voltak. A magyarokkal barátságos, sőt nem ritkán még súgorsági viszonyban is éltek. Ez pedig közös társalgási nyelvet feltételez. Neveik többnyire tőzsgyökeres magyar nevek voltak, és öltözetük nem különbözött a többi magyarokétól. Földjeiket a többi magyarok módjára rendszerint rabszolgákkal műveltették, és a földművelést, valamint a kézi mesterségeket még vasárnap és egyéb keresztény ünnepeken is szabadon és bántatlanul gyakorolták. A zavartalan biztonság, melynek a zsidók Magyarországon örventek.
Okay. And you can see where he's going with this. And what's fascinating is that Kon Sámuel makes this claim, and he readily admits in his book that the strongest proof for this idyllic picture is silence. He says, because there's no indications of persecutions or restrictions in this period, we can assume that the Jews had the exact same rights as all the other Magyars in this period. And what's interesting is that Kon is writing this in 1884, and I would say that what he's writing actually sheds more light on 1884 than it does on 884 or 894. And if you notice in this text, he talks about a közös nyelv, he talks about legal and social equality, he talks about the Jews being teljes magyarok, he talks about, he refers to them along with the többi magyarok. Okay, so for him, he's talking about words that we're familiar with from the 19th century. Also this whole idea of a zsidó hitű magyar, or a Mózes hitű magyar. And he uses these terms readily in his book when he's talking about the Khazars in the 9th century and in the 10th and 11th centuries. And what's interesting about this is that he bases this on very little proof, but obviously this is very important politically for him in the 1880s. Just to give you a sense of what's going on in the 80s, this is when the first debates about civil marriage are taking place. Okay, so there's heated debates about whether or not Jews and Christians can marry each other. There's heated debates about whether or not Jews should have the same rights as Christians. And it's taking place in this context. And interestingly enough, Kon's very words are used in the debates in Parliament about whether or not the Jews should have the right to marry Christians, whether or not there should be civil marriage. And I'll just read you one of the quotes from the parliamentary debates. This is one of the Jewish representatives, deputies, and he says, Ez bizonyosan nem közömbös dolog, kivált oly orák előtt, kik úgy látszik, a zsidó vérnek valami különös penetráns erőt tulajdonítanak. So, I mean, what he's doing here is he's saying that all of these anti-Semitic colleagues think that Jewish blood is so strong, and they should realize that going back to the 9th century, all of these Jews intermarried with Christians, which means that in order to understand the origins of the Hungarians in the 19th century, you have to understand that there were Jews that mixed with them in the 9th century. And if the 19th century anti-Semites think that Jewish blood is so strong, then they should acknowledge that all Hungarians are in some respects descended from Jews. Okay, so it's a pretty radical claim. This is a claim that comes up on all different occasions. Of course, it comes up during the Millennium Year. The Millennium Year, when everybody is at the height of their patriotism. And I'll just quote you from an article that was published in the eredete magyar irodalmi társulat's book. And this is from 1896. A magyarok vezérei oly környezetben nevelkedtek föl, hol a zsidó vallás tanai szelidebbé tették az erkölcsöket és a lelket fogékonyabbá a művelődés és település áldásai iránt. So here, this author is basically saying that it was the Jews also that prepared the leaders of the Hungarians were educated and raised in an environment where they were influenced by the Jews. And in this article, he also goes on to say that this is actually what prepared the Hungarian leaders later on to adopt Christianity. This is the same kind of argument that's used for Paul in the New Testament, that he was able to preach Christianity where there were already people exposed to Jews. So here's another kind of radical claim as well, that it's thanks to the Jews who were living here, these Mózes hitű kazárok, or Mózes hitű magyarok, it's thanks to them that Hungary adopted Christianity. Okay, so this is another role that's given to them. So, and then one other claim that I want to note before I move on to a kind of change in the character of this claim is that in 1896, one Jew made the claim that in 896, there were no Christians living in Hungary, right? This was a pagan country in 896. So the only religious confession in 1896 that could celebrate the millennium, that could celebrate the honfoglalás, and was actually at the honfoglalás, was the Jews. So this is part of this myth of origin, this foundation myth for the Jews of Hungary, that was popularized in the 1880s, 1890s, and to some extent was still around in the interwar period. I gave a talk related to this a couple of months ago in Boston, and there was a Hungarian student there who studied at the Lauder School probably about 10 years ago. And she said, oh yeah, we learned from our history teacher at Lauder that Hungarian Jews are descended from the Kazars. So apparently this myth has still been perpetuated in contemporary Hungary. So now I want to talk very briefly about a change that takes place at the turn of the century. And a change that also relates to the title of the talk, galíciai, gyüttmentek. And thank you, Gabor, for the title. Okay. So, in 1901, Barta Miklós published a book which probably all of you have seen for sale at the Skitiabolt, which you always go to, or at the little book stand at Moskva tér, which has all the best anti-Semitic books in Hungary. There's a book that's called Kazárföldön. Okay. This book was published in 1901. And what he does in this book, what Barta Miklós does in this book, is he takes this word kazár, which for Hungarian Jews was a sign of their belonging, was a sign that they were as much Hungarian as everybody else. He takes this term kazár and he turns it on its head. And what he does, I don't know if anybody here has read Kazárföldön. It's not the most interesting book, but some of you may have read it. What he does is he takes this word kazár and he uses it to refer to Galician Jews, to the galíciai zsidók. And these are primarily the Galician Jews who are in Carpathian Rus, in Kárpátalja, Kárpátalja, which I have here in orange. And in the book, he blames these kazárok, his code word for Galician Jews. He blames them for keeping the local Ruthenian population impoverished and drunk. He says that the Jews in Galicia, in Ruthenia, they all are engaged in petty trade. They're all selling palinka. In fact, they have a monopoly on the palinka trade. And limitations and restrictions need to be put on these kazárs. And immigration to Hungary needs to be restricted. That these kazárs, as he calls them, are going to change the very nature of Hungarian Jewry. These kazárs are dirty, they wear kaftans, they're Yiddish speaking, and interestingly enough, Barta Miklós distinguishes these Galician kazárs from what he refers to as our Hungarian Jews. Okay. And these are the Mózes hitű magyarok. And I'm going to ask you to read a remarkable passage here. This is a fairly long passage. And you can see in this passage how Barta Miklós contrasts the kazárok, which he sees as these Galician Jews, with the Hungarian Jews.
Lehetett hallani az előbb elég hangosan? Igen. Vallására nézve Mózes hitű. De a mi zsidóinkból, akik velünk barátkoznak, velünk étkeznek, velünk örvendeznek és velünk szenvednek, egyetlen vonás sincs bennük. Tehát senki se csináljon zsidó kérdést a kazár kérdésből. Nincs itt szó vallásról. Egy fajról beszélek, mely becsempészte magát hazánk felvidékére, meglepte a benszülötteket, miként a penészgomba végtelen organizmus. Azokról beszélek, akik magyarul sem nem tudnak, sem tudni nem akarnak. Egy vad törzs nyelvét beszélik, melynek se nyelvtana, se szótára, se irodalma nincs. E faj terjeszkedik, miként a fecskefonal a lóherésben. Körülfonja, behálózza, rátapad, kiszívja, és mikor elpusztul a megtámadott növény, akkor tovább kúszik az élősdik újabb áldozat után. Mert hiába lett ura annak a földnek, honnan a nemesebb fajtát kiirtotta, nem tud rajta belőle megélni, miután sorvasztó gazdasági rendszere a talajt is kizsarolja. A zsidó vallású magyarokat, akikben oly nagy az érzékenység, annyi tudásszomj, a becsvágy, a költészet, a zeneérzék, kérve kérem, ne azonosítsák magukat ezzel az érzéketlen, tudatlan, ambíció nélkül való, durván materiális és mosdatlan fajjal. Ne üldözzék, ne kárhoztassák Egánt, aki szerencsétlen és együgyű népet megmenteni iparkodik ennek a számító, élelmes, de erkölcsi tekintetben a vadállatok nívóján álló söpredéknek a karmai közül.
Okay, thank you. Egan is not so important. Egan was someone who was killed at the turn of the century, and one of the reasons that that Barta Miklós wrote Kazárföld was because of the injustice that he saw happening in Kárpátalja. But what's important here is that what he's doing is he's basically agreeing with people like Szabolcsi, and he's saying that the Mózes hitű zsidók, the Mózes hitű magyarok, are actually these very cultured and wonderful people who speak Hungarian and have fully assimilated into the Hungarian nation, and they are a mi zsidóink. But what he does is he takes this word kazár, which had only the most positive associations for the Hungarian Jews, and he turns us into a a word of opprobrium, a curse word. So that in the public discourse, after 1901, when anyone talks about Kazars, they associate this with Galician Jews, with Barta Miklos. They don't associate it with Kon Samuel. And we know this because suddenly in Egyenlőség and other Jewish newspapers, there's an effort to distinguish between Kazar and Kozar. So suddenly they start using the term Kozar to refer to the tribes that came in the 9th century, to distinguish them from the kazárok, who are now in the public imagination only associated with Galician Jews. So what I would argue here is that Barta Miklos actually hijacks this term kazár, and from 1901 onward, this basically becomes a curse word. And what happens to the whole Kazar myth is that this becomes challenged as well. And I'll give you an example of how this is challenged, and then I'll make a few concluding remarks. One of the things that's interesting about the whole Kazar myth is that it seems to appear whenever the Jewish question is debated or discussed. So it appeared in 1884 when civil marriage was discussed. It appeared in 1895 when receptio was discussed. It appeared in 1896 during the year of the millennium. Not surprisingly, it also appeared in 1920 when the numerus clausus was discussed. It also appeared in 1938 when the első zsidó törvény was discussed. So it usually came up when Jews would say, listen, we are as much Hungarian as the rest of you, and here's the proof, look at Kon Samuel. And in Parliament and in the press, Kon Samuel would be attacked by other historians, by other publicists, and by other parliamentarians. And what's interesting is in the debates in the 1920s about the numerus clausus, one of the anti-Semitic deputies, Huber János, says we have no historical sources whatsoever that the Kazar tribe allegedly, or that is to say, really came with the Magyars and consisted of Kazars who converted to Judaism. Okay, so silence for him was not proof that the Kazars came. Silence for him was proof that there were no Jews amongst the Kazars. And this was a kind of public refutation of Kohn's version of the story. And this public refutation, I would say, was codified by a historian that probably everybody here has heard of, Homan Balint. Okay? Homan Balint was the Minister of Religion and Education, with the Oktatási és, what was it, the Vallási és Oktatási Miniszter. And he published a textbook in 1933 in which he talks about the honfoglalás. And in this textbook, he mentions the kazárok. Keep in mind, these are the kazárok that Kon Samuel so confidently identified as Moses Hitu kazárok. And Homan, however, looked at these kazárok a little bit differently. For him, the kazárok were not Jews. They were, in fact, Khazars who rebelled against the oppressive Jewish leaders in Khazaria. Okay, in his words, in Homan Balint's words, they were dissatisfied with the Jewish ruling class, and they joined the Hungarian tribes as a way of escaping from the oppressive Jewish Khazars. So here I see Homan Balint as finally dismantling this Khazar myth of origin for the Jews. And to make matters worse, he actually replaces this Hungarian Jewish myth of origin with what I would call a counter myth of origin, which is to argue that if we look back at the Kazars and the Kabars, we don't see the origins of the Jewish contribution to Hungary. What we see instead is that at the very beginning of the Hungarian people, the very birth of the Hungarian people, there was already an anti-Jewish impulse. And of course, this was the kazárok, who joined the Hungarians precisely because they wanted to escape from those Kazars. Köszönöm szépen a szép hangot. Ha valakinek van egy kérdése, nem tudom, hogy állunk most. Hol van az elnök úr? Okay.
I'm speaking Hungarian.
Okay.
Excuse me. Egy apró megjegyzés, hogy volt Budapesten, illetve Pesten egy kis utca, az Operaháznál, az utca ma is megvan. Eredetileg úgy látom, hogy sokan tudják a történetet. Eredetileg az utcát gyüttmenteknek hívták, tehát abban az időben, amikor még német nevek voltak Pesten. Ezt követőleg úgy érezték, hogy ez nem lesz jó, hogyha Zsidó utcára fogják fordítani magyarra, mert minden utca név magyar nevet kapott, ezért Kazár utca lett előtt. Aztán amikor ez egészen fönnmaradt a kommunista időszakig, amikor úgy érezték, hogy ez nem lesz szerencsés, mert ők is pontosan tudták, hogy mit jelent a Kazár utca, ezért elnevezték egy zsidó operaénekesről, mert az Operaháznál van ez az utca, és az utcát most Székely Mihály utcának. Ez a abszolút közismert volt a Kazár történet, tehát a Közter is gyerekkorától kezdve ismert ezt a Kazár sztorit. Egy apró adalék.
Én azt szeretném megkérdezni, hogy a Hóman Bálintnak hogy hozott, tehát ez teljesen egy ilyen konstrukció volt, amit ő leírt, és nem támasztotta alá semmivel, csak így akkor ilyen antiszemita közérzület felé menő, nem tudom micsodába belehelyezte, és akkor az úgy ott maradt. Szóval, hogy így ezek a, mert itt ugye tényleg így, vagy hogyan, mert itt ugye három változat is volt, az egyik a Aba Sámuel, a másik a Barta, ők ketten így egyszer, és a harmadik a Hóman, aki meg átfordította teljesen negatív, a Hón szerint pozitív történetet, és ugye a Barta volt, aki meg azt, hogy ez semmi, tehát se így se, egyszer, hogy megalapozatlan, tehát hogy itt ők, vagy egyszerűen ők mind a hárman csak úgy kigondoltak egy elméletet, amit abszolút nem tudtak egyikük se alátámasztani semmivel, vagy azért valami...
Well, it's a good question. What we need to keep in mind is that, if we're dealing with 20th century history, we know more or less what happened every second of the 20th century. When we're dealing with the origins of the Kazars, we know very little. We don't even know if they actually converted to Judaism. We have very few sources from the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries. We don't know if they're forgeries or not in some cases. So basically all of these arguments are being made to some extent from silence. So when you have a limited amount of sources, you can make that limited number of sources fit your ideology or argument. So in the case of Aba Sámuel, he was able to see the origins of Hungarian Jews in the converted Kazars. In the case of Hóman Bálint, he was able to take more or less the same sources or the same set of sources and read his ideology into it. A 70-es években. Azért 70, nem emlékszem pontosan mikor írta. Igen.
Érdekes. Én úgy emlékszem, hogy annak idején úgy olvastam, hogy ez egy humoros könyv. Tehát, hogy ő egy percig se gondoltak.
A Köszön nagyon-nagyon komolyan vett a saját magát.
Nem tudom,
Nem, és a könyvet is.
Lehet, hogy én értelmeztem, mint hogy én tekintettem humornak.
Ma is vannak hívei a kazárelméletnek, mint genetikai kutatásokat is végeznek. A másik elmélet, az a lotár elmélet, és az egy jiddis nyelv eredetével függ, és az is gyenge lábakon áll. Úgyhogy ez máig nem egy lezárt fejezet.
Akkor mi volt az újdonság közben elméletében, hogyha már mindenki előtt elmondta a funkciót? Mi volt az újdonság közben elméletében, ha már mások is elmondták valamilyen szinten, amit ők
Mi volt az újdonság melyik szempont?
Közben.
Közben nem volt semmi újdonság, de ő popularizálta az egész legenda. És a Shlomo Sanz, ő egy izraeli történész most, és ő írt, azt hiszem kb. 4-5 évvel ezelőtt megjelent az ő könyve, az The Invention of the Jewish People. És az a Köszler bázisa, vagy a Köszler alapján. És azt írja a Szent, hogy a zsidó nép az egy kitalált nép. De mi tudjuk, hogy minden nép egy kitalált nép, akkor az nem egy újdonság.
Két apróság. Egyik, én legalább 15 éve voltam az országgyűlési könyvtárban, és ott van egy olyan nagyon érdekes könyv, ez akkor már körülbelül 40 éves volt, Cambridge Companion to Kazár History. Ilyen vastag, tele van, nem volt, amikor én felkértem, akkor nem volt még felvágva, én sem vágtam fel. Érdemes megnézni, hogy mára felvágta valaki. Nem tudom, hogy olvastad-e, vagy...
Igen, olvastad? Belelapoztam.
Belelapoztam. Hogy ez, a vastagsággal képest engem meglepő, semmit nem tudunk róla. Ez egy megjegyzés. A másik, van egy olyan köztársaság Dél-Oroszországban, Észak-Kaukázusban, Kabardino-Balkária, ahol a kabár név az ott van a nevükben. Van, akik feltételezik, hogy ők a kabárok. Lehet, hogy ők tudnak erről a történetről valamit. A másik dolog, amit én tudok, az, hogy Izraelben nagyon sokáig nem volt támogatva ez a kazár történet, ennek a kutatása. Most az elmúlt 2-3 évben adnak rá pénzt és elindult kutatás. Plusz nehezíti azt, hogy a régészeti anyag egyrészt a víz alatt van, ugye, mert hogy valami folyót ilyen nagy víztárolóvá szokás szerint bővítettek, és az alatt van. De hogy van elvileg egy nagy tömegű régészeti forrás is, vagy a víz alatt, vagy a víz fölött azon a környéken létezik, nem tudom, hogy az nem segít ennek a kérdésnek egy picit a tisztázásra.
Thanks for the comment. Actually, what I was doing here, none of this is actually based on, facts are not important here. I mean, I'm saying this as a historian. We know that volt egy kazár birodalom, and we know that there are remains of this. But one of the points that I'm making here is actually for Kon Sámuel, for Barta Miklós, for Homan Bálint, none of this actually really matters, right? There are dozens and dozens of books and articles about the archaeology of Kazaria. But none of these are actually really relevant to the myths of origin, whether this is the positive myth of origin of Kon Sámuel or the negative myth of origin of Homan Bálint. So most of what I've dealt with here is the way that the little bit of information that was available in the late 19th and the first decades of the 20th century was basically incorporated into various ideologies. For Kon Sámuel, this was the ideology of complete Hungarian assimilation, Hungarian Jewish assimilation. In the case of Homan Bálint, this was a kind of rejection of the Jewish contribution to Hungarian history.
Nincs sok kérdés, akkor én szeretném megköszönni Márknak a
És köszönöm Gábinak a